I really enjoyed the scene where they beam me up as Scroob and I get things a little wrong, and then my head is turned around and I'm looking down at my body and I say, "Why didn't somebody tell me my ass was so big?"
Did you know Mel Brooks needed George Lucas's blessing before creating his iconic Star Wars parody Spaceballs, 1987? Surprisingly, Lucas agreed on just one condition: no merchandise could be produced from the film. What many viewers don't realize is that beneath the sci-fi comedy exterior lies an unexpected foundation. But here's where it gets crazier. The entire film was secretly inspired by a 1934 Oscar-winning romance powered by genius improvisations and later inspired Tesla's ludicrous mode. And trust me, there's more. The hidden stories behind this movie will blow your mind, so stay with me till the very end. Mel Brooks's real inspiration for Spaceballs. It was often said that behind every iconic comedy lies an unexpected origin story. And in Mel Brooks's case, the inspiration for his beloved sci-fi parody came from a moment far more ordinary and far more personal than most fans ever guessed. Brooks once explained that the spark for Spaceballs didn't come from a boardroom discussion, a Hollywood trend, or even a studio request. Instead, it began at home, during what was supposed to be nothing more than a joyful celebration for his son Max. He shared in his memoir All About Me that Max had a Star Wars-themed 10th birthday party. The kind of event filled with excited children swinging plastic lightsabers and shouting out quotes from a galaxy far, far away. Brooks said he watched the kids completely lose themselves in the magic of the moment. And he remembered thinking, "Boy, did those kids love it." So he reportedly said to himself, almost like a comedian, realizing he'd missed the most obvious joke in the room: science fiction. Now there's a genre I haven't wrecked yet. Could a casual remark at a child's party really turn into a full-blown Hollywood production? According to Brooks, that was exactly how it happened. That simple moment of seeing raw excitement in his son's eyes stayed with him, especially as Max kept watching the Star Wars films on repeat long after the party was over. Brooks later said that watching Max return to George Lucas's world again and again made him realize something. If children and adults were this captivated by the genre, then there had to be room for a parody that both celebrated and lovingly mocked the stories, tropes, and cliches sci-fi fans adored. It wasn't just about poking fun. It was about playing in a sandbox that had shaped an entire generation's imagination. And wasn't that the perfect kind of target for a comedian who built a career on affectionate satire? By the time Brooks made this realization in the mid-1980s, he had already carved out a reputation as the undisputed master of cinematic parody. He had shaken up the Western with Blazing Saddles and breathed life into classic horror through Young Frankenstein, both in 1974, and audiences had come to expect that if there was a major film genre worth spoofing, Brooks would eventually get around to it. He even admitted in his memoir that although he made fun of these genres, he genuinely loved them. So there he was, years later, looking back on the list of everything he had already skewered, and he couldn't help asking himself, wasn't science fiction the only big one left standing? And if that was the case, how had he overlooked it for so long? But Brooks didn't want to limit himself to Star Wars. He pointed out that the sci-fi landscape was much broader, richer, and stranger than any single franchise. There was Star Trek with its earnest optimism, Battlestar Galactica with its dramatic space battles, and even classics like Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space, with its unintentional hilarity. Brooks often joked that the entire genre was practically begging for satire because it was rich with opportunities for comedy. And he wasn't wrong. Where else could you find laser swords, teleporters, space druids, and evil galactic overlords, all drifting in the same orbit. Yet, even with such perfect comedic ingredients, some critics wondered why Spaceballs arrived a full decade after Star Wars first took the world by storm. Roger Ebert was among those who questioned the timing, writing that the strangest thing about the film was that it should have been made several years ago, before our appetite for Star Wars satires had been completely exhausted. But Brooks wasn't particularly bothered by the delay. In fact, the timing turned out to give him something valuable: perspective. Instead of only poking fun at the films themselves, he could comment on the entire cultural wave they created, especially the explosion of commercialism that surrounded the franchise throughout the 1980s. And wasn't merchandising just as much a part of the sci-fi craze as the movies themselves by that point? Brooks used this to his advantage, weaving sharp yet playful critiques of consumer culture directly into the film. One of the funniest examples came from Lone Star, who famously declared after agreeing to rescue Princess Vespa, "We're not doing this for money. We're doing this for a shitload of money." Brooks loved using humor to point out the absurdity of a world where every movie seemed to spawn endless products, from toys to t-shirts to lunchboxes. And in a way, this allowed Spaceballs to become more than just a parody. It became a satire of an entire era's obsession with branding and profit. The origin of Spaceballs wasn't tied to Hollywood strategy or industry trends. Instead, it grew from something far more intimate: a father watching his young son fall in love with the world of science fiction. Brooks saw that joy, recognized the potential for comedy, and added his own twist to a genre that had already shaped so many imaginations. And perhaps the real question lingering underneath it all was this: who could have guessed that a simple 10-year-old's birthday party would spark the inspiration for one of the most unforgettable sci-fi spoofs in film history? What started as balloons, cake, and laughter somehow became the seed for a movie that would leave audiences laughing for decades. There's a plot twist here that most fans completely missed, something hidden in plain sight that changes the way you see the entire story. Stick with me, because you'll want to watch till the very end to catch every shocking detail. The plot twist most fans missed. When people think about Spaceballs, the first thing that usually comes to mind is its wild and brilliant parody of Star Wars, Alien, and almost every major sci-fi classic of its era. It had always seemed obvious that Mel Brooks was simply taking the biggest sci-fi hits of the time and turning them upside down for laughs, which he was famous for doing. However, he later revealed something that caught almost everyone off guard. He said the biggest influence on Spaceballs came from a completely unexpected place: the 1934 romantic comedy It Happened One Night. Many fans reportedly admitted that they had never connected those two films in their minds, because what did a Depression-era black-and-white romance have to do with a chaotic space parody filled with laser jokes, yogurt puns, and ludicrous speed chases? Brooks explained in his memoir that this classic Frank Capra film was the true narrative backbone of Spaceballs, and the revelation surprised even longtime cinephiles. It was not just any film either. He pointed out that It Happened One Night was the first movie in history to sweep all 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, and Best Actress, making it one of Hollywood's most important and celebrated achievements. Some wondered why a filmmaker famous for outrageous comedy would lean so heavily on a prestigious old romance. But Brooks reportedly said that Capra and his screenwriter, Robert Riskin, had created a groundbreaking pioneer in filmmaking, one so strong in structure that it could hold even the craziest parody on its back. Capra had been such a major figure in Hollywood that he became the first director ever to receive above-title billing, which Brooks described as a sign of how much respect he commanded. So why wouldn't a smart comedian borrow from the best when trying to build a story under all the jokes? Brooks often explained that he basically took the entire structure of It Happened One Night and, in his own playful words, shoved it into space. The original movie told the story of a runaway heiress who tries to escape a dull, wealthy groom and ends up finding herself stuck with an attractive, sarcastic commoner played by Clark Gable. This storyline, Brooks admitted, fit perfectly into a sci-fi setting. In Spaceballs, Princess Vespa became the space version of Claudette Colbert's heiress, and her fiancé, Prince Valium, served as the futuristic copy of the very, very rich but very, very dull groom from Capra's film. Lone Star, portrayed as a vagabond space bum with charm, stood in for Clark Gable's wise, cracking commoner. People later asked themselves how they never noticed the similarity, but Brooks explained that the sci-fi chaos around the characters was so loud, so silly, and so fast that many viewers never questioned the traditional romantic comedy framework underneath it all. After all, who would expect a space parody filled with Schwartz jokes to be secretly following a classic romance formula? He reportedly said that having that old-school Hollywood structure gave him the freedom to stack endless layers of jokes, references, and meta-humor on top of something solid. Without that foundation, the movie might have felt loose or chaotic. Because Capra's story had such clean bones, Brooks could push the comedy as far as he wanted, knowing the emotional through line would keep everything grounded. This also explained why the dynamic between Lone Star and Princess Vespa felt strangely familiar to some viewers, even if they couldn't place why. It was the same pattern audiences had seen in classic Hollywood romances for decades, just dressed in spacesuits and surrounded by jokes about merchandising. And in a twist, Brooks found hilarious. He claimed he received letters from young fans who had watched Spaceballs before Star Wars. They reportedly asked him why Star Wars wasn't so funny, as if George Lucas had somehow forgotten to add punchlines and cartoonish villains. Brooks often laughed at those letters, saying it amused him that some viewers treated Spaceballs as the original and Star Wars as the imitation. And perhaps the real question lingering underneath it all was this: how many young fans grew up imagining a galaxy far, far away, not as epic and serious, but filled with silliness, unexpected fourth wall breaks, and a hero who flies a Winnebago? The what-ifs of casting choices can completely change a story, and the surprises behind the scenes are even more shocking. Stick around and watch till the very end. You won't believe some of these revelations. Casting surprises and what could have been. The road to assembling the perfect cast for Spaceballs was reportedly filled with unexpected detours, lucky discoveries, and a few bruised egos along the way. And many people later admitted that the movie could have ended up looking entirely different if the original casting dreams had come true. It was said that Mel Brooks started his search for a lead actor by aiming sky high, reaching out to names that were already lighting up Hollywood. According to several reports from the time, both Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks were approached for the role of Lone Star, and both politely turned it down. One could only imagine how different the film might have felt with either of those two at the center of its chaotic universe. Their rejections reportedly arrived around 1986 to 1987, when Cruise was riding the wave of Top Gun fame, and Hanks was on the verge of launching into his breakthrough with Big. Bill Pullman would later say that he believed Mel Brooks was genuinely hurt when these stars declined, and he quoted Brooks as feeling stung that they didn't take him up on the offer. And really, who would expect two rising megastars to turn down Mel Brooks in the middle of his comedy prime? Yet, that twist of fate quietly opened the door for a very different kind of leading man. Attention then shifted to the casting of Princess Vespa, and Daphne Zuniga's involvement came with its own set of surprises. When she was first offered the role, she admitted to Brooks, almost apologetically, that she hadn't done much comedy and wasn't quite sure she could deliver what he needed. Brooks, in his typical quick-witted fashion, reportedly replied that her lack of comedy experience might actually be a plus. Zuniga later confessed that she had never even been a huge fan of Brooks' style of humor to begin with. Before joining the film, she thought his parodies were a bit too crass and not particularly funny. Could anyone have predicted she would later become one of the standout elements of the movie? She said her opinion changed dramatically once she began working with him, and she described Brooks as wacko in the most endearing way, chaotic, yes, but also deeply sensitive and strangely perceptive, in a way that made actors feel seen. That combination, she explained, helped her settle into the role and find the straight-faced elegance that made Vespa so entertaining against the film's backdrop of absurdity. Her performance, played with sincerity rather than silliness, became a perfect ingredient in the movie's comedic formula. But perhaps the biggest stroke of casting fate involved Bill Pullman, who, at that time, was almost completely unknown to the movie-going public. Brooks and his wife Anne Bancroft reportedly noticed him while watching an off-Broadway play, and something about his presence caught their attention. Pullman had only appeared in one film before, Ruthless People, which meant that placing him in a lead role was a bold move by any standard. Instead of being discouraged by Pullman's lack of name recognition, Brooks reportedly leaned into it with enthusiasm, famously saying something along the lines of, "Heck, I'll get somebody nobody knows!" That decision ended up becoming one of the most inspired choices in the film. Brooks later explained that Pullman had a natural charm, a calm presence, and a sincerity that made him instantly believable as Lone Star, and he felt confident he had chosen the right guy from the moment they began working together. Pullman not only stepped into the role without hesitation, he embraced it with such a grounded energy that Brooks said he delivered Lone Star lock, stock, and barrel. What are the odds that an actor with almost no film experience could become the heart of a sci-fi satire that would end up a cult favorite? And perhaps the real question lingering underneath it all was this: how did Spaceballs nail its casting so perfectly? People close to the production revealed that Mel Brooks's secret was simple but brilliant. He always said comedy lands best when the actor plays it completely straight. He drilled this into Zuniga and Pullman, insisting they treat the absurd world around them as perfectly normal. The result? Improvised gold and some of the funniest unscripted moments ever captured on film. Stick around till the very end. You won't want to miss a single laugh. Improvised gold. The funniest unscripted moments. Beyond its brilliant casting choices, it was said that Spaceballs gained a huge part of its charm from the improvisational freedom Mel Brooks gave his actors. A creative space that allowed small, unplanned moments to grow into some of the most quoted scenes in the film's history. People later recalled that Brooks encouraged his cast to loosen up, play around, and follow their instincts, because he believed that real comedy often lived in unexpected corners. One of the clearest examples of this happened with Rick Moranis during the famous action figure scene. According to the cast and crew, this moment wasn't in the original script at all. Brooks reportedly came up with the idea on the spot, telling Moranis that Dark Helmet should be caught playing with toy versions of himself and the other characters. But it was Moranis who took that simple setup, stretched it, shaped it, and turned it into a full improvised performance that fans still quote decades later. People on set remembered that these action figures were basically the only official Spaceballs merchandise ever made, which made the scene even funnier. When Colonel Sanders walked in on Dark Helmet's private playtime, it led to the now classic back and forth. "Did you see anything?" "No, sir. I didn't see you playing with your dolls again." "Good." Brooks later admitted that Moranis made him laugh so hard he ruined several takes, joking that the actor cost me a lot of money because Brooks kept breaking down in loud, uncontrollable laughter. Isn't it funny how the most iconic scenes sometimes come from moments that weren't planned at all? A similar sort of magic happened with John Candy, whose natural timing and gentle humor made Barf, the half-man, half-dog sidekick, one of the film's most beloved characters. People close to the production said that Candy had a gift for throwing out lines so casually that no one expected them to become memorable. After the Winnebago crash lands in the desert, Candy reportedly improvised the line, "Well, that's gonna leave a mark," right after forgetting his seatbelt was still attached as he tried to stand up. The delivery was so simple and so perfectly placed that it instantly became one of the film's biggest laugh-out-loud moments. Who would have guessed such a small, offhand comment would later be echoed by Chris Farley in Tommy Boy? The cast always said that Candy's warmth and lighthearted spirit brought an extra layer of life to the movie. And this throwaway line became proof that sometimes the best joke is the one nobody plans. Another moment that audiences still quote today came from Mel Brooks's long-running love of silly wordplay. The famous asshole crew gag wasn't written into the script in its final form. People familiar with Brooks's comedic style said he liked to revisit ideas from older works, and this bit was inspired by a naming joke he'd used in Blazing Saddles, where nearly everyone shared the last name Johnson. On the set of Spaceballs, Brooks reportedly tossed out the suggestion that the radar operators and bridge crew should all be named Asshole, and the actors ran with it. The result turned into one of the movie's most unforgettable exchanges. Dark Helmet demands to know how many assholes are on the ship, and the entire crew stands up and shouts, "Yo!" in perfect unison. Then comes the deadpan punchline, "I knew it. I'm surrounded by assholes." Isn't it interesting how a simple idea, thrown out casually in the moment, can turn into a scene people repeat for decades? Across every interview, behind-the-scenes story and cast memory, people kept saying the same thing. Spaceballs worked not just because the script was funny, but because the actors were encouraged to trust their instincts, take risks, and let humor happen naturally. It was reported that Brooks believed spontaneous comedy carried a kind of truth and energy that scripted lines sometimes couldn't match. Looking back, it becomes almost impossible to imagine the movie without these improvised moments. Would Spaceballs still feel as alive, as playful, or as endlessly quotable without the last-minute lines, the accidental jokes, or the inspired silliness of its cast? And perhaps the real question lingering underneath it all was this: how much of the film's magic came from pure spontaneity? People who worked on the movie often said that these unscripted gems became part of its heartbeat, moments born out of creativity, freedom, and a cast that genuinely loved making each other laugh. But there's a hidden force behind it all that most people never noticed. George Lucas played a secret role in the film's success, and you won't believe what he actually did. Stick around till the very end. You'll want to see this. George Lucas's secret role in the film's success. When people look back at the making of Spaceballs, they often talk about Mel Brooks' humor or the film's clever jabs at Star Wars. But what many don't realize is that George Lucas reportedly played a much bigger behind-the-scenes role than most fans ever knew. According to those close to the production, Lucas didn't just give a casual thumbs up. He shaped the project in several subtle but important ways that influenced what audiences eventually saw on screen. One of the most surprising details came from the agreement Lucas's team negotiated with Brooks, a strict rule that Spaceballs could never sell merchandise. People later explained that Lucas worried Spaceballs toys might end up sitting next to real Star Wars toys and confuse kids, collectors, and maybe even store buyers. Some wondered if that level of protection was unusual or even excessive, but others insisted Lucas was simply guarding the brand that kept his company alive. Brooks reportedly didn't just accept the rule, he found it funny, and even said it gave him more to joke about. And honestly, could any filmmaker have turned a legal restriction into comedy more brilliantly than Mel Brooks? Interestingly, Lucas's involvement didn't end with permissions or contracts. Reports from the crew suggested that Industrial Light and Magic, Lucas's own special effects company, offered technical help on several visual sequences. People familiar with the collaboration said Brooks genuinely wanted the effects to look polished, even though the film was a parody. ILM stepped in to guide certain shots, offering notes that helped Spaceballs reach a visual standard that audiences didn't expect from a spoof. It allowed Brooks to create some of the film's most memorable moments, including the gigantic Spaceball 1 and its hilarious transformation into Mega Maid. Some crew members later joked that the movie looked too good for a parody, thanks in part to Lucas's quietly supportive involvement. And this cooperation often left people wondering, wasn't it ironic that the very man being parodied was also helping the parody look impressive on the big screen? But the part of the story fans love most is how that no merchandising rule turned into one of the film's most iconic jokes. Brooks reportedly said that once Lucas told him merchandise was off-limits, he decided the best response was to lean directly into it and make it ridiculous on purpose. The result was the now famous scene where Yogurt, played by Brooks himself, enthusiastically shows off fake Spaceballs products, lunch boxes, dolls, bed sheets, and even a flamethrower. People who worked on the film later described the moment as Brooks getting the last laugh by turning the restriction into a meta-commentary on Lucas's massive merchandising empire. Many fans eventually saw that scene as more than a joke. It felt like a playful wink toward the entire blockbuster culture Star Wars helped create. And ironically, because the film couldn't legally produce anything to sell, the only real Spaceballs merchandise that ever existed were the prop items built for that very scene. Some collectors even wondered over the years if those props should count as the rarest merchandise in parody film history. In the end, the restriction proved to be a strange blessing. Instead of becoming a movie tied to shelves full of toys and branded products, Spaceballs stayed purely about the humor, the satire, and the joy of poking fun at filmmaking itself. People close to both Brooks and Lucas often said the dynamic between the two created something special. Mutual respect, mixed with mutual amusement. And really, isn't it fascinating how a parody ended up being shaped, protected, and even quietly supported by the very creator of the franchise it was mocking? The story behind Spaceballs reveals a surprising truth. Sometimes the best comedy comes not from total creative freedom, but from working around the limits set by someone who understands exactly what you're trying to do. Hidden production challenges and Easter eggs. The physical challenges behind the making of Spaceballs reportedly created a long list of hurdles that many fans never hear about. And people who worked on the film often said that the chaos behind the scenes was just as entertaining as the movie itself. Mel Brooks explained that even the desert shoot in Yuma, Arizona, brought its own strange problems because the team had to film long, wide shots that relied on untouched sand. He said the moment someone stepped in it or the wind blew too hard, the entire shot became unusable. Could anything be more frustrating during a tight filming schedule than sand that simply refused to cooperate? Brooks recalled that if the crew attempted more than one take, the sand would look disturbed and ruin continuity, so they constantly had to bring out a blower or a giant sand broom to make the landscape look perfect again. People joked that it almost felt like grooming a giant uncooperative sandbox. The extreme heat made everything harder, and the long desert days tested everyone's patience. The challenges reportedly didn't stop there, because the infamous Pizza the Hut costume became one of the production's most notorious nightmares. The suit weighed around 25 pounds and had layers of discomfort built into it. From a fiberglass undershell to foam latex skin, and even real food glued on as toppings. It sounded funny on film, but it was far from funny to wear. Actor Richard Caron reportedly quit after Mel Brooks demanded reshoots, saying he simply couldn't endure the suit any longer. Could anyone really blame him for reaching his breaking point? Adding to the film's surprising legacy, Spaceballs reportedly carried an unexpected connection to one of Hollywood's most iconic classics. Much of the movie was shot at MGM's Studio 15, the same stage where The Wizard of Oz was filmed. Mel Brooks said he would sometimes pause while directing and imagine the ghosts of Judy Garland, Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Burt Lahr dancing through the space, as if the walls still remembered the magic of 1939. Crew members even claimed they occasionally found original yellow bricks from the film lying around in odd places, as if they had been forgotten decades earlier and simply blended into the background of the massive stage. Wasn't it strange to think that a wild parody like Spaceballs shared its home with one of cinema's most legendary productions? The blend of history, chaos, creativity, and sheer physical challenge turned Spaceballs into a movie whose behind-the-scenes stories were almost as unbelievable as the jokes on screen, making the final film feel even richer once people learned what the cast and crew had to push through to bring the comedy to life. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.